Okay, so everyone's talking about this Gaza ceasefire, right?
Yeah.
But we wanted to go deeper than just, the headlines.
Right.
So we dug through reports from the New York Times,
Mm-hmm.
Haaretz, Axios, even international sources to kind of get the real story.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not just a pause in the fighting.
Right.
There's this whole hostage situation that's woven in and this whole three-phase deal
Right.
with a lot riding on it.
Yeah, it's interesting how this deal took months of intense negotiations and even some last-minute drama that almost tanked the whole thing.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And get this Biden and Fork working together to push it through.
I know, right?
That's not something you see every day.
Definitely not.
So what are the key things that you need to know about this whole ceasefire?
Well, first, understanding the three phases is really crucial because each one kind of builds towards a more lasting peace.
Oh, yeah.
But the success of each phase depends heavily on the one before it.
So let's break that down then, because I know from the reports that the initial focus is on this 6-week period to build trust.
Exactly.
And it starts with the release of 33 hostages.
Exactly. And this isn't just a random number.
Okay.
Many of these hostages are women, children, those in poor health, and men over 55.
Wow.
Think about the families who have been waiting, not knowing the fate of their loved ones.
Right.
Some have even received confirmation of their deaths already.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
The Haaretz report actually had some incredibly moving stories from families.
Yeah.
Like Sharon Lifshitz, whose father is being held hostage.
Oh, wow.
And she said, "I'm so desperate to see them if by some miracle my father has survived."
Yeah, those personal stories really hit home.
Right.
But zooming out to the bigger picture, the hostage release, while incredibly important for those families, is just the first step.
Okay.
It sets the stage for the really complex negotiations, which don't even begin until day 16 of the ceasefire.
So even with the initial ceasefire, the clock is ticking. What are they actually trying to negotiate during that time?
A permanent ceasefire and the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
Wow.
It's a framework that aligns with Biden's proposal back in May,
Okay.
but putting it into practice is a whole different ballgame.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But the sources also mentioned a ton of back and forth, even some last-minute drama that almost derailed the whole thing. What was that about?
Yes. The almost collapse of the deal just hours before the announcement.
Oh.
Reports, including one from ABC, suggested it was due to Hamas making last-minute demands.
Really?
Regarding the Philadelphia corridor.
And remind me what that is again?
It's that narrow strip of land along the Gaza-Egypt border.
Right.
That's strategically important for both sides.
So Hamas was trying to change the deal at the last minute.
Pretty much, yeah.
Why would they do that, especially when it seemed like everyone was finally on board?
Well, Israel accused Hamas of trying to alter pre-agreed arrangements on border control, something that Hamas denied. Their motives aren't entirely clear from the sources, but it raises some big questions.
Like what?
About Hamas's strategy and their true commitment to the ceasefire.
Oh.
Is this a sign of internal divisions within Hamas? Are they playing for time?
Yeah.
Or are they trying to extract maximum concessions? It's definitely something to watch closely.
Definitely a bold move trying to pull a fast one right at the finish line.
For sure.
But thankfully, it seems like Qatar, who played a huge role in brokering the deal, was able to smooth things over.
They were.
But let's get back to these hostages for a minute.
Okay.
Their situation has been front and center throughout this entire conflict.
It's a potent reminder of history repeating itself.
How so?
This hostage situation and the deal to secure their release draws parallels to the Iranian hostage crisis back in 1981.
Oh, really?
Remember, those American hostages were released just as Reagan took office?
Wow. That's a really interesting parallel.
Yeah.
You have to wonder if the timing is just a coincidence or if there are deeper political forces at play here.
It certainly makes you think.
Yeah.
And then there's Trump, who didn't exactly shy away from the spotlight.
Right.
He posted on Truth Social claiming the deal was a direct result of his election victory.
Classic Trump.
Yeah.
But seriously, how much influence do you think he actually had?
That's the million-dollar question.
Oh, that was right.
He was publicly pressuring Hamas, even threatening hell to pay if the hostages weren't released before his inauguration.
Wow.
Did that pressure actually push Hamas towards a deal, or was it more about posturing and trying to shape the narrative?
Right.
It's hard to say for sure.
But we do know that his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, was actually involved in the negotiations alongside Biden's team.
Yes.
That's pretty unusual, right?
Absolutely. The New York Times and other sources highlighted this unprecedented collaboration between the outgoing and incoming administrations. It speaks to the urgency and complexity of the situation.
It also makes you wonder how Trump's second term might impact the whole Israel-Palestine relationship. Like, will he continue to insert himself into the peace process? And will his approach differ significantly from Biden's?
Those are questions we'll be exploring in the weeks and months to come.
Okay.
But let's shift gears for a moment and look at the global reaction to this ceasefire.
Okay, so what's the world saying? It sounds like we've got reactions from China, the UK, Saudi Arabia. Even the Yemen Houthis weighed in.
It is a mixed bag, as you might expect.
Okay.
China welcomed the deal, the UK expressed cautious optimism, and Saudi Arabia urged a commitment to ending the Israeli aggression on Gaza.
Wow.
The Yemen Houthis even chimed in, saluting the resistance groups in Gaza.
But everyone's watching.
Yes.
And this conflict clearly has implications far beyond Israel and Palestine.
Absolutely.
But back on the U.S. side of things, is there anything significant about Biden and Trump? Two very different presidents presenting a united front.
It's definitely significant. Despite their political differences, they presented a unified message on this issue. That bipartisan approach likely carried more weight in pressuring both Israel and Hamas to reach an agreement.
And could this united front have implications for other diplomatic efforts in the region?
Possibly.
I'm thinking specifically about the potential for Saudi-Israel normalization.
That's a great point. Saudi Arabia has been hesitant to formally recognize Israel, and the ongoing conflict in Gaza was a major sticking point. Now, with a ceasefire in place, could this create an opening for progress on that front?
Okay.
The Biden administration has been actively pursuing Saudi-Israel normalization as part of its broader Middle East strategy, so it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So there's a lot more to this ceasefire than just a pause in the fighting.
Right.
It's about hostages, international pressure, and the potential for some really big shifts in the region.
Exactly. And we haven't even touched on the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza or the monumental task of rebuilding after such devastation.
Yeah, there's still a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
Let's dive into those issues after a quick break. Okay, so we've talked about like the politics and the drama surrounding this ceasefire.
Right.
But let's not forget about like the human cost here.
Yeah.
The situation in Gaza is dire. I mean, we're talking about a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
Absolutely. The scale of destruction is almost unimaginable.
Really?
The UN estimates that 90% of the population has been displaced, and tens of thousands of homes are just destroyed.
The images coming out of Gaza are just devastating.
They are.
And the World Bank estimates the damages are already exceeding like $18.5 billion.
Wow.
And that was back in April.
Yeah, and those are just the material costs.
Yeah.
We haven't even begun to address like the psychological and social consequences.
Right.
We're talking about a generation of Palestinians who've experienced unimaginable trauma.
It's hard to even fathom the long-term impact of that.
It is.
But let's focus on the immediate needs for a second.
Okay.
The ceasefire agreement includes provisions for humanitarian aid, right? What exactly are we talking about?
Right. From day one of the ceasefire, 600 aid trucks, including 50 field trucks, are supposed to enter Gaza daily.
Seriously?
This is a massive influx of resources for a population that's been on the brink of famine.
600 trucks a day.
Yeah.
That's incredible. But getting the aid into Gaza is only half the battle, right? You have to make sure it actually reaches the people who need it most.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky.
Yep.
The sources, particularly the reports from international organizations, highlighted concerns about aid distribution.
Really?
There are real risks of aid being diverted, hoarded, or even used as a bargaining chip.
Oh.
Transparency and accountability are going to be absolutely crucial.
This is a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder who's actually going to oversee this whole reconstruction effort.
It's going to require a coordinated effort involving Israel, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, neighboring countries, and international donors.
Wow.
There's going to have to be a lot of cooperation, and let's be honest, that's not something we've seen a lot of in this conflict.
That's putting it mildly. But let's say hypothetically that everyone manages to put aside their differences and work together. Rebuilding Gaza after this level of destruction is still a monumental task.
It is.
It's not just about bricks and mortar, is it?
You're absolutely right. Rebuilding lives and communities after this kind of trauma is a much more complex and challenging task.
The MSNBC article really hit on this point.
Yeah.
They argued that even if you rebuild the physical infrastructure, there's still this deep sense of mistrust and resentment.
Right.
Particularly among younger Palestinians who've grown up knowing nothing but conflict and hardship.
Right.
How do you even begin to address that?
That's the million-dollar question.
Certainly.
And it points to a bigger issue that often gets lost in the headlines.
What's that?
A ceasefire and humanitarian aid are essential, but they're really just addressing the symptoms of a much deeper problem.
So we're back to the fundamental issues at the heart of this conflict, right? The issues that have fueled decades of violence and mistrust.
Exactly. We're talking about land resources, security, and ultimately recognition and respect.
Right.
And until those issues are addressed, any ceasefire is likely to be temporary at best.
We can't just slap a Band-Aid on this and hope for the best.
Nope.
So what are the options? What does a viable path towards a lasting peace actually look like?
Well, the two-state solution has been the cornerstone of peace negotiations for decades.
Right.
The idea is to establish an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel.
Right.
But progress has been incredibly slow, and there's a lot of skepticism about whether it's even a realistic goal at this point.
The Global News report mentioned that even Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada has reaffirmed his support for a two-state solution.
He did.
But honestly, with all the baggage and mistrust on both sides, is it even possible?
There are huge challenges, both practical and political.
Like what?
There are disputes over borders, settlements, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees.
Right.
It's a tangled web.
And let's be honest, there are powerful forces on both sides who actually benefit from the status quo.
Yeah.
They have little incentive to compromise or make the tough choices necessary for a lasting peace.
That's a cynical but often accurate view.
Right.
So the question becomes, what can be done to break this cycle?
Right.
What would it take to create the conditions for a genuine and lasting peace?
That's where the international community comes in, right?
In theory, yes.
Okay.
But the international community is often divided and lacks the unity and resolve to act decisively.
Right.
And the U.S., as the traditional mediator, has its own interests and biases.
The MSNBC article was pretty critical of the U.S. role, arguing that they've lost credibility as a neutral mediator, at least in the eyes of many Palestinians.
I see.
So if the U.S. can't be a neutral broker, who can? And what role should other countries play?
That's a crucial question. And it's not just about governments and diplomats.
Okay.
Public opinion, grassroots activism, and even economic pressure can all play a role in shaping the dynamics of this conflict.
So it's not just about what happens at the negotiating table.
Exactly.
It's about broader shifts in attitudes and perceptions.
Exactly. A lasting peace requires more than just political agreements.
Okay.
It requires a fundamental change in the way Israelis and Palestinians view each other.
Wow.
A recognition of each other's humanity and legitimate aspirations.
That sounds pretty idealistic. I
Yeah.
mean, we're talking about decades of ingrained hostility and mistrust.
It is idealistic, but it's also essential. And there are people on both sides who are working towards that goal.
Oh, really?
Building bridges, fostering dialogue, challenging the narratives that perpetuate division and violence.
So there's hope, even amidst all the challenges.
There's always hope. But it's going to require courage, vision, and a willingness to make difficult choices.
Right.
And that's true not just for the leaders involved, but for all of us.
Speaking of difficult choices, let's circle back to Netanyahu for a moment.
Okay.
He's agreed to release 1,000 Palestinian prisoners as part of this deal.
He has.
That's a huge concession.
It is.
And it's going to cause him some political headaches.
Absolutely. His coalition relies on support from hardline factions who are strongly opposed to releasing Palestinian prisoners.
Okay.
Especially those convicted of violent crimes against Israelis.
The Haaretz article reported that some of his allies have even threatened to leave the government over this issue.
I see.
So he's walking a tightrope here.
He's trying to appease his right-wing base
Yeah.
while also navigating the delicate demands of this agreement.
Right.
And let's not forget, he's doing all of this with the specter of Donald Trump's return to power looming large.
That adds another layer of complexity.
It does.
Trump has been very vocal about his support for Netanyahu,
Yeah.
and he's also been critical of Biden's handling of the conflict. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out with Trump back in the White House.
It's a highly volatile situation.
Sure.
And the stakes are incredibly high. The success or failure of this ceasefire could have a ripple effect throughout the region and beyond.
So there's a lot riding on this.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're back. And I got to say, learning about, The scale of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the political tightrope walk, and all the international implications of this ceasefire, it's a lot to process.
Yeah, it is.
But I think the biggest question on everyone's mind right now is, will it actually hold?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources we've looked at paint a pretty mixed picture.
Yeah.
Remember, this truce is built on trust.
Right.
Which is in pretty short supply after 15 months of, brutal fighting.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of skepticism online, too.
Oh, really?
People saying this is just a temporary pause.
Right.
That the fighting will inevitably erupt again.
Yeah.
So what are the biggest, red flags here?
Okay.
Things that could really derail this fragile peace?
Well, the first hurdle is the hostage release itself.
Okay.
It has to happen smoothly without delays or complications.
Right.
Any hiccups could easily reignite tensions and undermine the trust that's been so carefully built up.
It's like walking a tightrope, right? One wrong step and the whole thing could come crashing down.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of the humanitarian aid.
Right.
It's not enough to just get it into Gaza. You have to make sure it reaches the people who need it most.
Right.
And that's a huge logistical and political challenge.
The sources, especially the reports from international organizations, were really hammering that point home.
They were.
They stressed the need for transparency and accountability in the aid distribution process.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. You don't want aid being diverted, hoarded, or used as a political tool.
Right. It's a complex situation with a lot of potential for things to go wrong.
For sure.
But even if the hostage release goes smoothly and the aid reaches the intended recipients, we're still only talking about a temporary fix.
Okay.
The real challenge, the one that will determine whether this ceasefire has any chance of leading to lasting peace, is the long-term reconstruction of Gaza.
That's a massive undertaking.
It is.
I mean, where do you even begin after this level of devastation?
It's going to require a coordinated effort, and I mean a truly unprecedented level of cooperation.
Wow.
Between Israel, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, neighboring countries, and international donors.
Okay.
Everyone has to be on the same page, working towards the same goal.
And that's a big if, right?
It is.
Given the history of this conflict, it's hard to imagine everyone suddenly putting aside their differences and working together harmoniously.
It is a tall order, no doubt.
Oh, wow.
And even if you manage to overcome the political and logistical hurdles, there are still massive practical challenges.
Go ahead.
Who controls the borders? Who oversees the rebuilding projects? How do you ensure that the reconstruction benefits the people of Gaza and doesn't just line the pockets of corrupt officials?
Those are all critical questions. But beyond the physical reconstruction, there's the human cost.
Yeah.
How do you rebuild lives and communities after this kind of trauma?
That's the most difficult question of all.
Yeah.
The psychological scars of this conflict will linger for generations. We're talking about deep-seated trauma, a pervasive sense of loss and insecurity.
Wow.
The MSNBC article we looked at highlighted this, pointing out the deep mistrust and resentment, especially among younger Palestinians who've grown up knowing nothing but conflict and hardship.
It's heartbreaking to think about.
It is.
It feels like this vicious cycle. Violence erupts, a ceasefire is negotiated, but the underlying tensions remain.
Right.
Just paving the way for future conflict.
Yeah.
So how do you break that cycle? What would it take to achieve a genuine and lasting peace?
Well, it's clear that a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange aren't enough.
Okay.
We need to address the root causes of the conflict.
Okay.
Land resources, security, and ultimately recognition and respect.
Those are big, complex issues with no easy answers.
They are.
We've talked about the two-state solution, but is that even a viable option at this point? There's so much skepticism, so much baggage, so much mistrust on both sides.
The two-state solution faces immense challenges. There are disputes over borders, settlements, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees.
Yeah.
And frankly, there are powerful forces on both sides who benefit from the status quo.
Yeah.
They have little incentive to compromise or make the tough choices necessary for a lasting peace.
So what's the answer? Where do we go from here?
That's the question we all need to be asking ourselves.
Right.
What role should the international community play?
Yeah.
How can we create the conditions for meaningful dialogue and reconciliation? What can each of us do as individuals to contribute to a more peaceful future?
This deep dive has given you the facts, the context, and multiple perspectives on this complex issue. But it's ultimately up to you to form your own opinions.
Right.
To engage in thoughtful discussions and to advocate for the kind of future you believe in.
Yes.
This story's far from over.
It isn't.
The next 6 weeks and the months and years that follow will be crucial
Yep.
in determining whether this ceasefire represents a genuine turning point or just another temporary pause in a seemingly endless cycle of violence.
Right.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay hopeful. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.